Well, good morning. Good to be with you again. And so far we've had two talks. First of all, looking at what we call the Apostolic Age. That is the first 100 years of the Church, where we have rich evidence from the Scriptures about what Christians were thinking about the Eucharist and how they were celebrating the Eucharist. Then we went on to what we would really call the Patristic Age, that is the next 200 years, when the Christian Church was under persecution from the Roman Empire. And so worship really had to be rather hidden away. And our evidence is rather limited, although fortunately some documents have survived, and you were able to see the description of the Eucharist from Justin Martyr, and then two documents from later, which show that the Eucharist we have today was pretty much established by that time, by the year 300, 320, something like that. So today we go on to the Middle Ages, and it's a huge period of time. And I just begun by saying here, by the time of the peace of the Church, that's 313 AD, when Christianity became tolerated, the Romans agreed they would not persecute Christians anymore, they would not put them to death, although we do know that it went on happening in some places even later. But by that time, the basic shape of the Mass was established. There was the Liturgy of the Word, inherited from Jewish religious practice, readings, a homily, and prayers. And we can say that's the didactic part of the Mass, the teaching part. And then we get what we have inherited uniquely from Jesus Christ, the Liturgy of the Eucharist, which is those four actions: the taking of the people's gifts, bread and wine, a thanksgiving prayer, and then the breaking of the bread and the distribution of it, and the giving of the cup. And we've seen at this time that the thanksgiving prayer, the Eucharistic prayer as we would call it now, was often kind of made up on the spot, although we think it pretty much always included an account of the institution of the Eucharist, what Jesus Christ did, just as ours does, the words of consecration. But otherwise, we read that the president of the Eucharist, the priest or the bishop, has to kind of make up the prayer as best he can. And we have to understand, no books at that time, Maybe they were lucky to have a manuscript of some kind, but most times not. So by this time, the Eucharist as we know it is pretty much established. And at the same time, with this toleration of the Church, bishops were able to meet together. There were some councils of the Church, and the main doctrinal tenets of the Christian faith were agreed. And particularly important here was the First Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. And so you get the first form of the creed written down and established and agreed. And a little bit later you get the canon of Scripture. That is, they agree which books they recognize for the Old Testament, which is pretty much inherited from the Jews, and which books will go into the New Testament. There was quite a lot of discussion about that. And then, towards the end of that century, in fact, in 380 AD, Christianity was not just tolerated as one religion of the Roman Empire, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, what had before been the private worship of small groups of Christians in different places now became the public religion, the religion of the great empire, and the emperor was a Christian. And this brought about a significant change. First of all, there was a big change for the clergy. The clergy before had been very much servants of the people. Probably they carried on with their own jobs, and then they would just meet with the people on Sunday for the celebration of the Eucharist. Now they became officials of the empire. They probably got a salary of some kind, and bishops were important people. And so the clergy begin to think of themselves as rather important people, which before they hadn't. You will know whether that's a good thing or not. So, first of all, the setting of the Eucharist changed. Now, buildings were set aside for worship. We call these buildings churches. But before this, the church meant the community, the gathering of the people. So now we, to distinguish that, we have church with a small c to denote the building, church with a big C to denote the community. And because they wanted buildings for worship, they would take over buildings which were already there, because paganism now was out. It was out of favor. And so they took over pagan temples and just adjusted them to become churches. Rome is full of these. A lot of the churches were originally pagan temples. And, from outside, you can see the pillars that were there. Maybe the most famous is the Pantheon in the middle of Rome. Pantheon means of all the gods. So this was this huge temple dedicated for all the pagan gods. And it's an extraordinary building. It has this dome, which for those times, Roman times, was an extraordinary feat of engineering to build that dome. Well, the church took over that, The old gods were out, and it became the church of all the martyrs. Before, all the gods, now all the martyrs, remembering the people who died during the persecution. And there it is. You look at the outside, and it looks like a pagan temple. It is very much a Roman building. But inside, it's a church. And these pagan basilicas, typically they were kind of rectangular with a semicircular apse at the back, where originally there would be the throne of the emperor, or if it was a law court, the throne of a judge. And now that is where the chair of the celebrant was put. So, the celebrant felt rather important sitting in this place. We can also see that the depiction of Christ in the catacombs where the Christians sometimes met for the Eucharist because nobody wanted to go into a cemetery, it was a kind of private place. They would have Mass down there sometimes. And we see there, scratched on the walls, pictures of Jesus Christ, which are him as the Good Shepherd. Well, now you get pictures of Jesus Christ as a king, wearing a crown, sitting on a throne. There's a kind of sense that he's not so much, our familiar friend, he is the ruler of the universe and our judge. And at this time, the early Christians were expecting the world to end. The New Testament is full of that, this expectation that the world is going to come to an end. But by this time, 400 years on, well, the end of the world hadn't come, and, we still believe that Jesus Christ will come again, but it's not something at the forefront of our minds. And so there was a different attitude to time. And this is the time when the church calendar began to form. Like having Lent and Easter, Advent and Christmas, and also feasts of the various saints and martyrs. So the calendar is not looking forward to Jesus coming again, it's looking to the past, and in a way it's solidifying the past. Well, once you'd got these church buildings, ceremonial developed. So the priest, who before had just, turned up to celebrate the Eucharist with the people, and as I said, it might be outside, it might be in a private house, now would come to the church and he would put on special vestments. And there would be other ceremonies which were taken from the imperial court. It's from this time that, they're carrying candles or having candles on the altar. Candles which are a kind of like a decoration rather than simply functional to give enough light to see by. And incense was used because incense had been used in the imperial court. So the liturgy, the Eucharist, becomes much more, instead of just like sitting around a table, a small group of people, now it's up above the people, and it becomes something that they're looking at rather than taking part in. It's a completely different feeling. In the Eastern Church, the monks, this is the time where the monastic life begins, and they took on the sense, these were the real Christians, and anybody else was kind of secondary. But ordinary people, ordinary lay people who were not monks, felt unworthy to be at the Eucharist. I mean, they would go to the Eucharist, but they didn't feel they were worthy to receive communion. And from this time, you get that very famous communion hymn, which we still sing. Let all mortal flesh keep silence, and with fear and trembling stand. Ponder nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God to earth descendeth, our full homage to demand. So this moment of the Eucharist when Christ is made present is something fearful, is something tremendous. And ordinary people simply no longer felt worthy to receive communion. And it's from this time as well that you get fasting, the idea of fasting to prepare for communion. Remember that the very first Eucharist, that as we know from St. Paul, were within the context of a meal. People were having a meal, and then you would have the breaking of bread. So none of them were fasting. Now, fasting, because it's a sign of respect for the Eucharist. And gradually, whereas at the beginning of the Church's history, there were many catechumens, many people who wanted to come into the Church, gradually there were no catechumens. Every baby was baptized as a baby. And, there was probably, once Christianity had become the official religion, there was probably a flood of people wanting to become Christians. But then that dried up. And so, whereas at the end of the first part of the Mass you would have the dismissal of the catechumens, that stopped. It was no longer that clear division. And so people lost this sense that really the Eucharist was in two parts. It was all seen as one thing. Now, while this was gradually happening, the words of the Eucharist were also changing, or rather being added to rather than changing. First of all, there was a strengthening of the sense of worship. In the first part, there was an entrance chant. So as the priest was coming in, this chant would be sung. And then there was an opening prayer, what we call the collect or the opening prayer. Before this, we hadn't had that. But now you begin to get an opening prayer which reflects the different seasons. So, you would have Lenten opening prayers, Easter opening prayers, prayers for various important feast days. And that was something new. Also, at the beginning of the Mass, there would be a litany of praise, something, saying something about God and then saying, we praise you, or have mercy on us. And that litany continued in the Eastern Church for a long time. But in the Western Church, it kind of dried up or became simplified. But we still have it. This funny little thing that we say after the penitential rite. We say, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. That's all that's left of the litany. And we even say it in Greek pretty often. We say, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Kind of amazing because, who here speaks ancient Greek? No, none of us do. But if we do that, at Mass, we're perfectly calm about it. We're happy to do it. Also added was the Gloria. That's something we take for granted now on major feast days and every Sunday, the Gloria, but it was added about the 5th or 6th century. And at the beginning, only for limited use. And the Creed was added in a few places as a test before communion. Now, especially in the Eastern Church, because there'd been problems there about what Christians were believing. So, before communion, or maybe before the offertory, they would say the Creed, or they'd sometimes do it like we do at Eastertide, saying, do you believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? And, everybody had to reply, I do. And it was not so common in the West, where heresy was not such a problem. And So it became restricted simply to Sundays, and it didn't become obligatory on Sundays until 800 AD. So, the Creed is really one of the most modern things in our Mass. And, it is still restricted really to Sundays and great feast days. Now, you'll see I'm talking about the East and the West. If you think about Christianity, it came from the East, came from Jerusalem, then was in Antioch in Syria, and then in Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, then in Greece, and then finally came to Rome. And then it was in North Africa as well. And there was a sense that the church was one. And for the early centuries of the church, Greek was the language used among educated people. But gradually, during this first part of the Middle Ages, there was a separation between the East and the West. And of course, that separation continues. We have the Roman Catholic Church, which is in a way the Church of the West, of Western Europe. And then there is the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Church of Greece, and then eventually the Church of Russia as well, because missionaries went from the Orthodox Church in Greece and Eastern Europe and into Russia. And sadly, this is one of the problems in Ukraine, because Ukraine spans between Europe and Russia, so that in the eastern side of the country, there are many, many Orthodox. It's a kind of majority of Orthodox. In the western part of the country, where many missionaries came in from Poland, there are more Catholics. And historically, they didn't get on. There was always kind of jealousy between them. And so the war at the moment is a kind of secularization of that feeling between the Russian side and the Polish side, between East and West. The only good thing about it now is that, both the Western Church and the Eastern Church are saying, stop, peace is the most important thing. So I said here on page 2, from the 4th century, there was a gradual separation between the East and West of the Roman Empire, beginning with the loss of a common language. Educated people in the West, especially in Italy, knew Greek into the 300s and had been happy to worship in Greek. But Latin was the common language. And around 400, St. Jerome made a complete translation of the Bible into Latin. That is, into the vulgar tongue, into the language of the common people. And so that is, in Latin, is called the Biblia Vulgata, or the Vulgate is called the Vulgate Bible. But what that means is the Bible put into the vulgar language, the common language of the people. So people were becoming more and more used to Latin. But funnily enough, when you have a very important Mass at St. Peter's, like on Easter Day or Christmas Day when the Pope is celebrating, the Gospel is always read in Latin and in Greek, because it's a sign that, the church is the church of everyone. It is, it's not that the Western Church has suddenly said, the Eastern Church is forever separate. It's a recognition that there is one church. And in fact, Orthodox people, if they want to come to a Catholic Mass, they can go to communion because we recognize that they are part of the ancient church. So as far as the Mass goes, for a time the Mass prayers were in Greek, and then they would have the readings in Latin. But under pressure from Christians from North Africa, Latin was gradually accepted in Rome as the normal language of worship and became the language of the whole of Western Europe. Latin became the common tongue. And we tend to forget that English, French, Spanish, Italian, they only became common languages towards the end of the Middle Ages. It's not as if everyone was talking English and the educated people were talking Latin. It's just English had not even been invented at that stage. Now, the Greek language and the Latin language are different. Greek is flowery, poetic, philosophical. Latin is a very brief and practical language. So it's juridical, it's military. And so the translations of the prayers, even when there were the original Greek prayers, once they were translated into Latin, they became much briefer. And gradually you see a separation between these long Greek prayers and the economical Latin prayers. So from this time we get two distinct traditions. And the thing is complicated further because the great controlling influence of the united empire of the East and the West was the Roman Empire. The Romans ran the whole world as it was at that time. But gradually the Roman Empire began to break down. You had a series of poor emperors, and then there was this strange kind of invasion from Eastern Europe, Northern and Eastern Europe. These people called the Goths, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the barbarians, they came out of the north and east into the west and even down as far as Rome. And so the Roman Empire was broken up and there wasn't that central control. Before this time, in every little town, you would have a Roman governor. You would have, Roman soldiers posted there. And there was a sense of being part of the Roman Empire. Well, all of that was breaking down. So I said, from the 6th century, the organization of the Roman Empire began to break down. Northern tribes invaded the more civilized southern countries, so communication and central control were poor. That allowed for variety in the West. And then from the 7th century, the Muslims became a major force in the homelands of Christianity, the Middle East. So the Eastern Church was weakened and isolated. Its liturgical development was frozen in time and would seem very elaborate to us in the West. So, this wonderful Roman Empire, as it began to break down, you had these people coming from the north and the east. Then you had Muslims from the 6th century onwards. They took over what we would call, the Holy Land, and they went further into, into what was like Syria and then into Turkey. And they also gradually, actually remarkably quickly, took over the whole of North Africa. And eventually they even came up into Spain. So, the central control of the church was lost. There were whole territories where the church was kind of abandoned for a time. And from that time onwards, you get two traditions. You get the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition. Now, the East was kind of frozen in time at that point, because the Muslims ruled what was then the Eastern Empire. They ruled it right up to the end of the First World War, right up to only 100 years ago. There were Muslims in Constantinople. There were Muslims in, the countries of Eastern Europe who were very, very strong. There was the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. They ruled the whole of the Middle East. And they had, huge influence in North Africa as well. So the Eastern Church, that didn't have the development which our church did. And they have 3 Eucharistic liturgies, which have been in continuous use for 1,500 years. They're still using it. The Liturgy of St. James, which is used in Jerusalem, the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is the normal Orthodox liturgy, which goes back to the Eucharist of West Syria from the time when St. John Chrysostom was bishop of Syrian Antioch, before the year 400. So an amazingly long history. And then the Liturgy of St. Basil, which is used on 10 days each year, again, dating back to before 400. Now, they had this sense, they had this very, very elaborate Eucharist. It's still the case. And this sense of the great holiness of the Eucharist, so much so that really the people were not meant to participate hardly at all. And their churches have a screen across them, a screen covered with icons. It has little doors in it, which are open now and again, they'll open the door and somebody will come through and read the gospel. But basically, the altar is behind the screen. And, it's felt that it's people, when the Eucharist is being celebrated, the people should not even see it because it's too holy. And behind the screen, women were never allowed to go. Only the priests and the deacons and the subdeacon, that was considered the holy area. And I always used to say, I spoke to an Orthodox priest and said, oh yeah, I believe, only you are allowed to go behind the screen. And I said, I bet that's the case until the place needs cleaning. And then you allow a woman in there. Now, in the West, it's a kind of time of confusion. But also, remember, this is an awfully long time. From 400, we're talking about, until 1500. And in that time, you've got in the middle of it the millennium, 1,000 years. Now, everyone was convinced that at the 1,000-year, Jesus would come again. So they kind of let the churches fall down and, they didn't bother about things. But then, Jesus didn't come again. And after the millennium, there was the building of massive churches. It's said, in France, in, the kind of 150 years after the millennium, 30 cathedrals were built, 200 major churches, and 500 smaller parish churches. More stone was quarried in France in those years than was ever excavated in Egypt for all the pyramids and everything. They were just building and building and building. And actually it was in France that the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, they'd had several abbey churches, but their third church was an enormous church. And they even did what you're not meant to do. They built a larger church than St. Peter's. Absolutely huge. And, absolutely kind of most magnificent church. So there were those things. And then, of course, about the 1300s, there was the Black Death, the Black Plague, and half the population died. Again, churches got into ruins, and then after the plague had passed, new churches were built, magnificent churches. But as far as the liturgy in the West went, there was the Roman Rite. The popes in Rome, their ceremonial and their words of prayers were written down. So we know the Roman Rite developed a little bit, but it was marked by that Latin economy. In Milan, there was a slightly different rite, the Ambrosian Rite. In Northern Europe, as particularly in France, there's what's called the Gallican Rights. The Gallican Rights, somehow they were more influenced by the East, and so they had more prayers and more lengthy prayers. And then in Spain, there's what's called the Mozarabic or Gothic Rite, and that was partly influenced by the East. It was also partly influenced by the Muslims, because they were in the southern part of Spain. And it survived there. It didn't change because Rome could not have so much influence in Spain. So at this time, there was this variety according to where you lived. We know now, wherever you go in the world, the Mass is the same. It's translated into different languages, but in fact, it's the same. You may not understand the words at all, but you know exactly what they're saying and what's happening. Well, at this time, if you traveled around Europe, you really couldn't know what was going on because there were these different traditions. And Rome was not strong enough to impose unity. I mean, what could Rome do? You couldn't send an email. You had to send a messenger on a horse. And by the time he got there, maybe the rule had changed anyway. And there was this terrible problem. There was no printing. So you couldn't have an official liturgy printed and get it distributed. What you did get is, civilization and the liturgy continued because of monasteries. Monasteries had hundreds of monks who would copy out copies of the Bible. They would copy out, books of prayers and so on. And we can, fortunately, those have survived, those manuscripts, and we can see how they were praying at that time. But there was a lot of variety at that time. So I said, between 500 and 800 AD, there was tremendous variety because of unstable political conditions outside Rome. Priests sometimes returned to the ancient tradition of improvising the Eucharistic prayer because they couldn't get a written copy of it. In Rome, the Mass of the Pope became the standard. Ceremonies were written down, Nothing was improvised. The Eucharistic prayer became fixed, although again, the people had become spectators by now. Things became a little better around 800. There was an important emperor, Charlemagne. He became king of the Franks. Now, the Franks at that time kind of included Germany and France, and eventually he was given the title Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And he wanted to have unity of liturgy in his empire, in his area. So he got the help of a British Benedictine monk called Alcuin, and together they imposed a compromise rite. So basically, they got the Eucharist from Rome, and they added some Gallican elements, some French prayers, French in the French form. And that's more or less what we have today. Good copyists in monasteries made this available to different churches. However, around the basic structure there was great variation because of the influence of the calendar, pleasing the local people. So, you would have areas where you would remember particular saints, and so you would get, particular feast days. And sometimes you would get devotions which grew up in different places. For example, in England, they wanted to have a feast of the Trinity. And they asked the Pope if they could have a feast of the Trinity. And he said, no. Every Eucharist, the Trinity is there, mentioned again and again. You can't have a feast of the Trinity. Anyway, over the course of 150 years, they kept on trying, and finally, they were allowed to have the Feast of the Trinity in England, and in the end, the Trinity, we have the Feast of the Trinity today. But, we think, the Feast of the Trinity, it's always been there. It's only been there halfway through our history, or actually rather less than halfway through our Christian history. And there are many other things like that, where gradually local practice began to influence the bigger church. However, I want to get back to this essential point to understand. The medieval Mass had a very different feel to the ancient breaking of bread of the early Christians. The music of the chants became more important than the words, and even the Kyrie and Gloria were extended for the sake of music. This is in cathedrals, in monasteries. This is when religious music started. At the beginning of the Eucharist, they wouldn't be singing hymns and things, we don't think. But gradually, you got the Kyrie, the Gloria, and other things sung. There were many opening prayers, collects instead of one, reflecting local concerns. So now you only have one opening prayer for the Mass, one collect. But there you would add a collect recognizing the local saint of the church, or the saint of the diocese, or you would add on another collect praying for the harvest that year, or you would add on another, in time of war. So you'll get a whole series of these collects. Now, halfway through our history, in the 10th century, a penitential rite was introduced at the beginning of Mass. Before this, again, it's something we take for granted, but until this time, there was no penitential rite. It was understood that people who were in a penitential situation, they would not be admitted to communion, and at the very beginning, they would have to leave halfway through the Mass. But now, everyone was more or less in the situation of sin, and so you had this penitential rite. Also, by the time the middle of the Middle Ages, the homily and the intercessions had disappeared. You know, that teaching element at the beginning of the Mass. So you would have the readings, but then you would go straight to the offertory. There wasn't a homily. Sometimes at the end of Mass there would be a homily, and it would be like a teaching about how to live your life. It wouldn't be a commentary on the Gospels anymore. You know, since the Second Vatican Council, the Church has really encouraged priests to preach on the Gospel of the day. And the homilies would have been in Latin, and gradually, as the new languages of English and French, they emerged, the common people, wouldn't understand Latin. So that wasn't particularly helpful, you know. So the losing the homily was not a problem at all. There were a number of private prayers for the priest at the offertory, which we still have, and there were a lot of them before communion. And these communion prayers for the priest before receiving were about his unworthiness to receive. But they were private prayers, you know, the people wouldn't even hear him saying them. And there were no prayers for lay people at that age, at that time, because nobody would go to communion. Common people did not go to communion. Because of nobody was taking communion, there was a blessing at the end of Mass. You think about it now, we always end the Mass with a blessing and a dismissal. Now we know from the earliest Masses, the earliest Eucharist back to the 2nd, 3rd century, there was a dismissal telling the people to go. There wasn't a blessing because they just received communion. And in fact, really, even today, you know, the blessing is a kind of a bit of an insult in a way because you've got Jesus Christ within you. You don't need a blessing. You are blessed by receiving communion. But here, you had the blessing because people had not received communion. They just felt they weren't worthy of it. Now, in places like Italy and even France, the dioceses were very, very large. And so people never saw the bishop. You know, the bishop would, before, every little city was a diocese, in the East particularly. Now, the bishop would be in the big city, and the people would never really see the bishop, and the priest would be the person they saw, and the priest used a simplified rite, because there wouldn't be a choir, there wouldn't be a whole group of monks singing, they wouldn't have the vestments and altar servers to do the ceremonial. So in ordinary churches, the rite became very simplified. And at the same time, in monasteries and then the ordinary lay priests, the diocesan priests, they wanted to say Mass every day. You know, before maybe you'd had Mass only on Sundays, but you got this practice of saying Mass every day, and so they wanted to use this simplified, quicker rite. And you get what we call low Mass. You know, when some of you were young, I mean, I remember it, there was low Mass, which was the weekday Mass, and there was a high Mass. And usually on Sunday, the early Mass was a low Mass. And actually it was quite popular because it only took half an hour or even 25 minutes, you know. There was no homily. And, you know, so you would go to the low Mass, and then you could go home and have a big breakfast because you would be fasting before Mass. And later on, you could go to the high mass, there would be music, and the whole thing would be more elaborate. But low mass became the normal thing, whereas earlier, this more ceremonial mass was the norm. The lay people's part was reduced to seeing, not much hearing, because the priest was turned away from the people, and Latin was not understood by the common people anyway. So it's been saying, people went to Mass to see, not to consume the host. They wanted to see the host because they felt they were not good enough to receive the host. And so the center of the Mass was the elevation of the host. And the priest would be on this side of the altar, and he would have his back to the people, and he'd be muttering away in Latin. People wouldn't necessarily know kind of where he'd got to. This is when they introduced the bell. We still have the bell just rung once when the priest begins what's called the epiclesis, calling down the Holy Spirit over the gifts. It's the beginning of the consecration. And the bell was introduced at that time because the people were just sitting there. They didn't know where we're going on. The bell, We're getting to the time when we're going to see the elevation. And then when the elevation came, the bell was rung again, 3 times so that people would see it. At first, it was always just the elevation of the host, then gradually the elevation of the host and the chalice. But that was the center of the rite. And the priest was told to hold up the host as high as he possibly could. It had to be above his head so the people could see it. And there are various accounts of medieval masses with the people shouting out to the priest, "Hoist it higher," because they wanted to see the host. They said, "Mr. Priest, hold the host higher so that we can see it." Because that was the center of the Mass. So at least they could see the host, even if they could not receive. And eventually, this elevation of the host, this is between 1200 and 1500, so, the end of the Middle Ages. Eventually, the Mass was going on in Latin. The people couldn't understand it. The priest had his back to them. And we know that from that time, they began to say their own prayers. It was from this time, the end of the Middle Ages, that the Rosary became important. The Rosary is, in the history of the Church, a relatively late devotion. It's a late medieval devotion. But it was perfect. People would say the Rosary to themselves while the Mass was going on. And they just break off to see the elevation. And we also know that rich people had little prayer books at this time. Some of these have survived. And, beautifully written out, beautifully illustrated. Not printed books, remember. Everyone had to be done by hand. And so there was a growth of private devotion and a sort of a sense that my private prayers are more important than the Mass. The real thing is the Mass is the center of our Christian life, not our private prayers. And once you'd got that thing, that private prayer is so important, then that was the beginning of the Protestant faith, this sense that it's just me and God, whereas our Catholic sense is we are part of the Church. We are part of a great community, At every Mass, we are part of a community which includes the angels and saints. So that kind of opened the door to Protestantism. And that's where we kind of end today, because we get up to about 1500, and that's the time that Protestantism begins. And it's helped by the fact that from this time you've got printing. You've got printed books so that people could have their own little private devotions. Even common people who'd never been able to have their own book before. Now, because of printing, they could. All right. Next week, maybe we'll have time for some questions. But time now is time to prepare ourselves for Mass. Thank you.